Hi everyone, this is Yash, and I welcome you to Season 1, Episode 2 of the Talent Talks, an initiative by the Talent Tribe powered by Superbeings. Today, we'll be talking about how to design and set up a performance management system. What are the key constituents? What are the key aspects to consider? And some best practices. Today, we have with us Saurabh, who's an independent HR partner and advisor to businesses. He works with startups and growth stage organizations as a consulting CHRO to design and implement HR best practices. He also partners with HR tech startups to help them drive IP creation and product differentiation. He has over 2 decades of experience in both HR consulting and line HR roles with organizations like Hewitt Associates and InMobi, which was India's first unicorn startup. He's an alumnus of the St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and the Indian School of Business, Hyderabad. What an illustrious background. Hi, Saurabh. Welcome to the Talent Talks. Super excited to have you here today.
Thanks, Ashat. Really excited to be here as well, and very excited about what you guys are doing at Super Beings. Looking forward to being part of this.
Great, awesome, Saurabh. So, just for the benefit of the audience again, today what we are looking to do is talk a bit about a performance management system, specifically how to design one, what are the key aspects to consider when designing a performance management system, and what are some key best practices which you have seen across your couple of decades of work experience work well. And essentially the idea is to get people started on their own so that they can go back, take the learnings from this talk today and go deeper by themselves to design a system which works for their organization. Sounds good?
Yep.
Awesome. Sure. So why don't we start simply by kind of talking about what constitutes a performance management system? What are the key aspects which fall under the purview of a performance system? What is it that organizations need to think about?
So as I see it, Yashat, there are three fundamental aspects of performance management. The first is goal setting, where you're really telling people what's expected of them, how will they be assessed, getting them familiarized with all of that. The second is feedback, and again, there can be various flavors of feedback, whether it is a formal check-in, whether it is informal on-the-go feedback, but feedback is the second important component. And the third component is reviews, where you sit back and say, okay, fine, these were the expectations of you. How did you perform against those expectations? Where are you doing well? What are your development areas? So as I see it, there are three fundamental blocks, which is goal setting, feedback, and reviews. And then there's a lot of other things that come around it, which can be customized to the context of the organization, the culture, your business, etc. But really, it's these three which I see as the three fundamental pieces.
Awesome, interesting, sir. So let's get started with goals specifically. I think that's one of the most important aspects, which tells people what they are expected to do. But when it comes to picking a goal system, now there are a lot of goal systems which we see out there. We've heard about MBOs, we've heard about balanced scorecards, we've heard about OKRs, which are the latest fad maybe today. And we also have heard about other aspects like KPIs. So what should organizations really look at when they are choosing a goal system? And is there a guiding principle which you can talk about when organizations are looking at these goal systems? How do they choose one?
It's a great question. I think before we start talking about which to choose, let's also understand a little bit of history of this. So it really started with MBOs, which were introduced by Peter Drucker in the 1950s. I think 1954 it was. Prior to 1950s, what used to happen is that management used to sit together, say, what are our objectives as an organization? What are our organizational goals? But that didn't really get cascaded to the lower level team members. What team members were told was very specifically, these are the tasks that you need to perform. And they didn't really see how those tasks are really feeding into the larger picture of the organization, and it wasn't considered necessary. So when Peter Drucker introduced MBOs in 1954, it was a huge shift in thinking. It was really about telling people that this is what our goals are as an organization. This is how it cascades down to your function, to your team, and then to you. And if you think of it at some level, it's really about also what we've been hearing a lot about from Dan Ariely and Dan Pink, about three fundamental factors of motivation, which is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And this was really bringing in some sense of purpose, saying that, okay, this is what you're doing and this is how it feeds into the larger picture for the organization. Now, that fundamental thinking has remained unchanged from a performance management standpoint, which is about telling people that this is where we are as an organization. This is how it cascades down to your level, to your role. And each of the performance management systems that we speak about post that, whether it be balanced scorecards or whether it be the recent fad, like you said, of OKRs, all of them pick up on that one fundamental thing of saying, what are our organizational goals? How do we cascade those down to the employee, and not just be talking to the employee about what are the tasks that are expected of them, but how what they are doing contributes to the larger picture. Now, our MBOs lasted almost about 4 decades till I think Kaplan and Norton in the 90s actually came up with the balanced scorecard approach. Why did they come up with this? Because what had started happening with MBOs was, and again, different organizations could have different flavors, different ways of implementing MBOs, but the classical approach was to say that you create a list of objectives for each team member, and again, those are put in order of priority, which one's the most important, and then coming down that way. A lot of times managers started using these objectives as a way of dinging employees, of saying that, okay, you did A, B, C, D things, but you didn't do E, F, G, and therefore, you haven't performed as per expectations. There wasn't also a lot of monitoring and tracking that was possible, because these objectives were typically, again, as per the classical notion, measured or assessed on an annual basis. So by the time a person got to know how they're doing, the year was over and there was no time to make changes. The other thing that was missing was saying that, okay, one thing is what are the business goals of the company in this particular year, but really where are we from a vision and a mission perspective? How does that translate into what it means for our customers? What does it mean for us from a financial perspective? What does it mean from a learning and growth perspective? What does it mean from the perspective of internal processes? And that's where the balanced scorecard actually brought in these 4 parameters and said, let's analyze expectations, or let's set expectations, objectives on these 4 dimensions. So there was a lot of color and flavor that suddenly got added. There was the ability to actually link this back to the organization's mission and vision, while translating it down into what your annual objectives are. And again, putting them into these 4 buckets or these 4 dimensions kind of helps people see a more cohesive picture. So now, as far as balanced scorecard was concerned, a fairly comprehensive approach, but at some level, it is also reasonably static across the year. Once you've defined what are the parameters for the balanced scorecard for the year, then it pretty much continues to remain like that for the entire year. As we started getting into this VUCA world, as we started getting into hyper growth mode for companies, as companies started getting more aspirational, taking far larger amount of risks, there was a need to adjust and tune objectives far more regularly. And the second thing that happened was that both MBOs and balanced scorecard really talk about goals which are directly achievable. Whereas when you're talking about startups, when you're talking about growth phase companies, you don't know how things are going to pan out. It's about being able to very quickly adapt, being able to very quickly pivot, as well as setting the bar really high, knowing that maybe there's a small percentage of chance that you'll get there. There's a good chance you won't get there. In fact, the way OKRs are defined, first of all, OKRs are defined typically on a quarterly basis. The second thing that happens with OKRs is that it is almost always stretch goals. In fact, if an individual hits about 75% of their OKRs, it's considered that you have achieved your goals. Unlike an MBO or a balanced scorecard, where it meant achievement of goals meant hitting 100% of your goals. So that is one fundamental difference between OKRs and other performance management systems. Like I said, it looks at super stretch goals, and when you hit even 75% of those goals, it's considered that you've actually achieved your goals. The second big difference is that they're typically done on a quarterly basis. The third difference is that it's really about achieving overall outcomes. And therefore, the onus is not just on that particular individual and what they are doing, but saying कि ये हुआ कि नहीं हुआ. And that's where, again, it applies very well to startups and growth phase companies, because then the individual can't say that, oh, this was not in my control, or I will take full credit for it. It's all about everyone coming together, making those things happen. This person is the one who's accountable for orchestrating it. So these are the three fundamental differences. Now, going to the second part of your question, how should a company think about what they should pick, what they should choose? I think, especially since a lot of the audience that we have today will be companies which are in the startup or the growth phase and pretty much setting up things from scratch. I've done a lot of work with startups, and what I've seen is that things tend to happen on a more ad hoc manner. Then suddenly someone says, oh, you know what, we're growing as a company, we really need to do something. Maybe it's investor pressure that has come in. Maybe somewhere the founders had a conversation with someone who told them, oh, how are you looking at performance in the organization? And suddenly they say, oh, we need a performance management system. And suddenly we get into saying, oh, you know what should we pick? Should we pick MBO? Should we pick balanced scorecard? What I would say is go back to the fundamentals and say, what is it that we really want to do? We want to make sure that people understand what's expected of them. We want to make sure that they get feedback, and we want to make sure that we're able to assess how they did against the expectations at the end of the period. So what's more important right now, instead of picking one or the other, is to say that how are we going to do this? These are the three things that we really need to do. What works for our organization? Where are we in our journey? What's the market that we're operating it in? How volatile is it? If you are an organization that is in a fairly volatile market, you are in hyper growth mode, yes, OKRs have been seen to be more effective. There again, it's also important to look at what level of employees you're talking about, whether the roles tend to be more static and well-defined, which typically happens at the professionals level, or as you start getting up into middle management and senior management, where it's a lot more individual focused, a lot more situation focused.
This is great, sort of great history about the various goal systems which have existed, and I think this gives a great idea about what the differences between between all the three systems is. And what I hear is that for growth stage organizations and fast moving organizations, maybe OKRs are probably the better way to go, because they support more agility and they support more alignment and essentially challenges. So what I'm hearing essentially is that OKR seems to be the way to go for younger, fast growing growth stage startups or organizations looking to move in a more agile manner. And because OKRs allow you to be more agile, they drive alignment, they help you drive accountability in the whole population of the organization. But one of the challenges which we have seen, or I have come across when in my conversations with a lot of founders and HR leaders of young organizations, is that it becomes hard to drive OKRs at all levels of the organization. And typically organizations kind of stop at the top 1-2 layers. So is it even possible to kind of have OKRs across the organization at all levels? Or do you think if we are looking at a goal system which is well suited for the entire organization, we might need to look at some different options?
So, and I think I briefly touched upon this, that it depends on the level of management. At the junior or professional levels, as I prefer to call it, roles tend to be a lot better defined. There are certain expectations that exist which are fairly well understood, fairly homogeneous, and therefore OKR per se may not be as relevant at the professional level. At middle management, again, it depends on the nature of roles, nature of job, etc. But I would agree with you that OKRs work best at the senior levels. As roles get more standardized, don't need to go all the way to OKRs. It might actually be an overkill. Even the maturity to be able to understand that you're being set a goal and it's okay if you do 75% of that goal is something that may not work at the junior or the professional levels. In fact, what I've seen in organizations that have just gone about doing OKRs across all levels is that it also has this negative thing where it becomes acceptable to be not hitting your goals. And at some stage, you're suddenly asking yourself that, okay, what is it that we're holding the person to? So what is 75% of your OKR? And again, we like putting these percentages out there, and it's important to put some scale, some parameters. But honestly speaking, can you really say, apart from maybe a sales target, can you really say what does 75% mean versus 70% versus 65%? You can't. And therefore, there is a certain level of maturity that's required when you're looking at OKRs. And when I say maturity, I'm talking about the employee group that you're working with.
Correct, correct. So what we are saying is that at the senior level, OKRs work really well. As we go down, as clarity on roles emerge, it might be different beneficial to look at different goal systems. But is there anything specific which organizations can then do to align the org objectives to the individual goals, assuming that the OKRs are only adopted at the top levels?
So that's the role of the manager becomes very important, because a manager is someone who understands, or should ideally understand, where we are going as an organization, what are our objectives as a company, what are the OKRs that I as a manager have for myself, and then explaining to the team member that the role they do, how does that contribute towards achievement of those objectives. So for example, you might go with a much more simple KRA KPI kind of approach for junior levels, where you might say, let's take an example, drive customer satisfaction or drive customer delight might be the larger goal. Now that gets broken down into specific KPIs, how you're measuring that. Now for a software engineer, maybe it's about quality of code and the number of errors in code that is actually going to contribute towards customer delight. And it's the manager's role to explain how we need to get better and better at that because of our larger goal of driving customer delight.
That's really insightful, Saurabh. So thanks a lot for that. Now the last two questions on goals before we move on to part about driving performance. What is the recommended frequency of one, setting goals, and then secondly revisiting goals in the organization, and does that differ across levels in the organization?
This is an interesting one. Goal setting is typically something that should be done annually, but then depending on the kind of roles, depending on the performance management system or approach that you have decided as an organization, I would recommend, and also depending on the kind of market environment that you're operating in, at least from an OKR perspective, we've already said it needs to be done quarterly. Even for the junior professional levels, while the goals might be set for the year, there may be a need to revisit the goals on a quarterly or on a half-yearly basis. Now, this also becomes important because career progression at junior levels is obviously faster. So you might actually have people whose goals need to change with the way they have progressed in proficiency in their particular role, or possibly moving on to the next level. So there is a need to revisit, to fine tune. You may not change the goal per se, you might not change the KRA per se, you might not change the KPIs, but you might modify the targets.
Great, that's great, Saurabh. So now moving on to the driving performance part, and we briefly spoke about feedback as an important lever on driving performance. How would you think, what would you think is the importance of feedback in driving performance? And is that the most important lever which managers have or organizations have when it comes to driving the desired performance in the organization? Or are there other aspects which people can look at?
So before I directly answer that question, let's take a step back. Let's take a step back and say, what is the objective of performance management in the first place? Why is it necessary? And I would say the increasing philosophy amongst forward-looking organizations, among leading employers, is that performance management is really about guiding the team member, helping them live up to their potential and to further grow their potential, to help them understand what they're doing well at and what they should do more of, and what are the areas where they need to develop, where they need to get better. So if you take a flavor of performance management being largely focused on developing team members, helping them achieve their potential, and not what we traditionally think of as performance management, saying that, based on performance management, people will get their increment or their bonus. Increment and bonus is one outcome. Career progression is another outcome. Role changes might be a third outcome. But really, the fundamental focus of performance management has to be about developing the team member, helping them achieve their potential and build their potential. Now, if you come from that thinking, then feedback becomes the most important part of performance management. In fact, I would say that maybe you don't even need formal annual reviews if you want to reduce your administrative load. If you want to, if you can't do anything else, the two things that you must be doing are setting expectations, which is the goal setting part, At the end of the day, people need to know what is expected of them, what they will be assessed on. And the second is giving them feedback. Feedback is also very important from the perspective, and I do a lot of work on employee recognition as well. Recognition, one major component of recognition is appreciation. Appreciation being just helping people know that we value them, we are willing to invest in them, and that's extremely important. Now, the fact that a manager has taken out time to give feedback to a team member itself makes the team member, or should help the team member, believe that the manager is invested in me, that the manager is helping me get better at what I'm doing. Therefore, if there's nothing else that you're going to do, just do feedback, and feedback is really, really important.
Great. So I think I agree with you there, Saurabh, and that is the philosophy which we have been trying to bring into what we do as well. But one of the questions, I think you already touched upon that feedback is very important. If people can't do the annual reviews, they should just look at giving feedback more regularly. I wanted to touch upon what do you consider as regular feedback, and like, is there a recommended frequency of giving feedback? Should it be like most organizations, for example, today have just this annual review cycle, where people get feedback, but is there a better frequency which people should look at? Should it be quarterly, monthly, real time, or anything in between?
So feedback is again an Uber thing. It's a continuous process. Feedback can be even you telling me right now that, Saurabh, can you actually break down your responses a little more, be a little more granular about what you're doing, and you can be telling me that right now. Maybe we do 3 talks over the next 3 months, and then at the end of that we come back and we say, okay, how did we do on those? And then you tell me, okay, Saurabh, on the whole, these are the things that were working well, these are the things that you could do better at. So feedback is an ongoing process. Feedback should be given as regularly as possible, but then it's about also synthesizing that feedback. So if you are a manager who is honestly, sincerely giving feedback to your team member, and you're giving it at an ongoing basis, then imagine how much the feedback a team member would be getting over a period of even a month, or leave alone a quarter or a year. So there is a need to then also take all of that feedback and synthesize it for the team member. Because if you tell people to work on 10 different development areas and you tell them there are 5 things that you're doing well and do more of that, it's really difficult for someone to focus on it. So synthesizing feedback, which is what happens in quarterly or mid-year reviews, is something that is extremely important as well. And of course, the feedback loop continues into the annual review, where then you say, okay, across the entire year, let's pick up from each of these specific points of feedback that you gave and see what is the larger picture that emerged. How did you do against your goals? What enabled you to achieve your goals? And therefore, what are the things that you should be doing more of? And what are the areas that kind of held you back, or where you could have done better, and hence what is it that you need to develop? I think when we talk about feedback, again, one thing which is very, very important, a lot of managers think of feedback as just telling people, oh, this is what you need to do better, this is what you did wrong, this is an area of improvement for you. But feedback is equally about telling people what they did well, reinforcing certain behaviors, and telling them what they should do more of. In fact, if you think about the entire strengths finder philosophy, and maybe I'm going off into a little bit of a tangent, but it's about positive psychology, and it's about telling people that these are the things that you do well, and how can you employ these tactics to achieve various types of objectives, rather than saying that these are things that you don't do well, and therefore you need to start developing from scratch. There are certain things that fundamentally come easier to us. There are certain things that fundamentally make us feel happier when we're doing those things. We kind of go into a zone, or we go into a state of flow, and it's important to emphasize those things and highlight those to the team member.
Awesome. So actually, I had a follow-up question lined up for you there, which I would have asked later in the talk, but now, since we brought that topic up, I wanted to kind of touch upon that aspect as well. That what exactly should be covered, and you briefly mentioned about what kind of feedback to give. But to the audience here, when they are designing PMS system and including feedback as an aspect of performance management, should they look at mandating, or should they look at incorporating things like goals, things like developmental areas, things like what needs to be better, etc., in their feedback meetings? And is there a template or some sorts which people can look at? So, for example, We have looked at templates like start, stop, continue, which are more developmental in nature. But are there other templates which you think might be useful for organizations when they are looking at setting up these one-on-one or these feedback meetings between the managers and their team members?
So I think feedback needs to look at multiple things. You mentioned, should we be talking about goals? Absolutely, you need to talk about goals, because otherwise, how do you tell a person that they're doing well or not doing so well? At the end of the day, it boils down to, are you achieving your goals or are you not achieving your goals? Of course, that is one part of it, because talking about goals just really talks about the what. It doesn't talk about the how. And that's where you need to go beyond just the goals and then say, okay, these are the key areas of strength that emerge. These are the key areas of development. There again, it's not enough to just leave it at that. Feedback must be actionable. And that's where I'm a huge fan of the start, stop, continue framework, because then it becomes a lot more actionable. Things that you were doing in the past are not relevant for you anymore, or things that were derailing you, stop doing those. Things that were your strength, things that you were already doing well at and which were relevant, continue doing those. Things that you need to learn from scratch, that you need to really develop on, are things where it becomes a start. So the moment you link action items to overall feedback, it becomes a lot more powerful. Apart from that, I would say that don't get overly carried away by templates. I think what tends to happen to us as HR professionals is we also need to manage things at scale. We have limited timelines. Typical, ratio in a large established organization would be one HR person to 100 employees. Maybe in startups or growth phase organizations, that ratio is a little better. But we get so used to, as HR professionals, handling scale, ensuring compliance, making sure that the process has been completed, that we tend to start losing track of why we were doing this in the first place. And that's where I would say don't get too carried away by templates. It doesn't matter if a person fills every box in that particular order. And that's what we tend to focus on as HR professionals. What's important is that what is the employee or the team member taking away from that? What is the flavor of the conversation and the spirit with which the manager has had that conversation with the team member? In my mind, the more open templates that you can provide, the better. So the start, stop, continue just gives you 3 boxes. Now in those 3 boxes, write what appeals to you, write what makes sense to you. It doesn't have to be as per a prescribed no. First line should be this, second line should be this, third line should be this. So I think templates are a little, I would say, overemphasized where they shouldn't be, and getting too carried away with templates, terminology, jargon, etc. makes us lose sight of the larger spirit and flavor of performance management.
Awesome. I think that's great advice, Saurabh. So just one last question on the feedback side, specifically when it comes to the process perspective. So typically what we have seen is that when you leave it on the manager or the team member or the employee, these feedback conversations don't really happen in the frequency in which they should happen. So do you think it is the onus of the HR leadership and the team to kind of mandate that as part of the process, or have you seen it work in a voluntary manner also in some organizations? So what do you recommend for the viewers here? Should they include that as a mandatory part of the process, or leave it as a voluntary thing to do between the manager and the team members?
So I think it's a fine line. Even if everything is working well, even if managers understand the importance of giving feedback, of managing performance, more importantly, team members understand why performance management is beneficial for them and it's not this, stick that is being used to beat them up. Even if they understand all of that, especially in startups, growth phase organizations, we're all, running at very, very high speed. Intention is there, but it's like, oh, you know what? Today there was this fire, tomorrow there's that fire, let's do it next week. Oh, next week something else happened. And it tends to get missed out, even though intention might be there. So I think there are 2 things that HR must do. The first is to actually help people understand why feedback, why performance management is important. It should actually be something that a team member demands or asks for, rather than something being thrust upon them. And yes, however, HR does need to put forth certain timelines, certain calendars, certain amount of tracking, because even when intentions are there, because of the number of things that are competing for our attention, and performance management or giving feedback doesn't come as the most burning priority, it kind of gets left out. So that's the role that HR needs to play. Create that culture of feedback, create that culture of understanding why performance management is important to the extent that a team member is actually demanding it. And the second is where there needs to be some amount of tracking, there needs to be some amount of follow up, saying, oh, you haven't had conversations with 3 out of your 5 team members, so you need to get that done. So a little bit of push is required, as long as the primary flavor remains around why is it important. I think that's what we need to focus on. Little bit of tracking, little bit of measurement, follow-ups are required. There's no getting away from that.
That's great, guys. So thanks a lot for that. I think it is time to move on to the last leg of the performance management journey, which we started with, which is around reviewing performance. Now, I realize you love starting with talking about why is it needed and what is the importance and intent behind doing that. So why don't we start with talking about why are reviews needed? Why should we be doing them? Are they important and why?
So reviews are definitely important. It kind of closes the loop from where you started out, saying that these are the expectations, these are your goals. If you don't tell people at the end of the year how they did against their goals, then you haven't closed that loop. So just purely from the perspective of closing that initial loop, it becomes critical. And of course, it's about then preparing the person, saying, okay, this is how you did through the year. On the basis of this, I'm telling you that these are some of the strengths that emerged. These are some of the development areas that emerged. Whether the person's getting promoted or continuing in the same role, this is what you need to focus on when you get into your next performance cycle or your next performance year. That is extremely important. Of course, there are further things that derive from performance management and from the performance reviews, which is about what kind of increments a person should get, what kind of bonus a person should get, if there is any sort of career movement. Now, there again, I want to talk a little bit about one of my pet peeves, which is that today appraisal and increment have kind of become, go hand in hand, and people confuse the two words. And that's telling you that performance management to a lot of people has just boiled down to, acha, mere ko increment kitna milega? Yeah. And that's not what performance management is supposed to be. In fact, a lot of organizations have moved away. There used to be a time where you would get your performance feedback, and then immediately at the end of that conversation, your manager would share your increment letter. Companies have tried to break that. They've said performance conversation has to be different, increment conversation has to be different, so that people realize that performance management is much larger than the increment. The other thing that's changed in thinking, and this is getting a little bit into the reward side of things, with the market becoming so dynamic, companies have moved from an internal driven approach to salary management, which used to be in terms of pay ranges. In fact, if you go back and maybe in certain parts of the government, you'll still see it saying that, oh, this is your pay grade, and at this pay grade you will spend 2 years in this, then you will move to the next pay grade, then you will move to the next pay grade. Now that's all gone out of the window as far as modern organizations, modern corporates are concerned, especially when you're talking about startups, growth phase organizations. People are doing so much more. They are spending lesser time in organizations. Their expectations in terms of career progression, etc., are so much higher. Now, because of that, the way I look at increments is to say that an increment is about where I see you or your capability, and therefore how much should that capability be paid with a view of what's its value or worth in the market. So your past year's performance is an indicator of your proficiency, but it's not to say that you got consistently exceeds expectations last year, hence you should get a 25% increase. It's about you got a consistently exceeds expectations last year, therefore in your role I see you. And if I were to break a journey through a particular role into a learning phase, a proficient phase, and an expert phase, I see you now fitting into the expert phase of this role. And therefore, on the pay range, I'm going to map you on the higher side. And therefore, I determine what your increment is. Increment also now has a second flavor, which is about corrections. So what tends to happen, and this happens a lot in the startup world today, when we have people who are homegrown, internally grown, they've been getting certain organic salary increases year on year. But especially when you're hiring laterals, experienced people from the market, everyone's asking for nothing less than a 25-30% increase when they're coming on board. Now, what tends to happen therefore is people who are with you in the system, who've been staying longer, tend to be at a lower side. How do you correct for that? Because at the end of the day, from a compensation philosophy perspective, the philosophy I prescribe to organizations is that people performing at a similar level in the same role should be paid similarly.
Yeah.
So therefore, again, organizations are moving away from saying that if this is your rating, this is the fixed percentage increase that you will get. Some organizations have said use this as a guideline. Some organizations have completely done away with that and say that it's your position in range and where we see your proficiency for the role as the two indicators of how your increment is going to be determined. So it's about really using the performance conversation to assess the proficiency level of a team member and say this is how we are therefore going to pay them. So it is related, but it's not a direct translation. Bonuses, on the other hand, tend to be for performance that was displayed in the previous year, and therefore there is a direct linkage of your bonus payout to your rating. But going back to proficiency, the proficiency thing is again then used to say, okay, fine, you operated at an expert level of this particular role. We see you being able to take on responsibilities of the next level. So maybe we are going to take a bet on you and say, let's move you to the learning phase of the next level. So that's where the career movement part of it comes out. So once again, the performance conversation or the performance review at the end of the year has to be about what was your goal achievement, because that sets the basis for the conversation. Then saying what are your strengths, what are your development areas, what should you start, stop, continue doing. As an outcome of that, the manager then says, where do I see this person fitting in with regard to their proficiency for the role, and hence what increment should we be looking at. Bonus can be a direct outcome over here. Career movement again is a more derived outcome.
This is amazing, Saurabh. I think, and I'm sure it is a conversation which can take another full hour in itself.
Oh, absolutely. Don't even get me started.
Yeah. But I mean, I just wanted to have a quick follow on this thing, which you said that performance review and increments are related but different aspects. Now, how do organizations convey this to people? Because in the heads of the person who's getting reviewed, it looks like a direct correlation that there was a review done. I was given a rating. I was said, okay, I'm at this proficiency level, and hence my increment is going to look like this. So is there something organizations can do to kind of break this in the heads of the people themselves, which is probably the most important aspect of making sure people take the performance review process more as a developmental activity rather than as an assessment activity?
So one thing, Yashat, that I already spoke about was breaking down these two conversations of the performance review and the increment. In fact, increasingly, I've seen organizations do the performance review, then post that there is a discussion that is had internally where typically managers will assign increments to team members that goes through a level of calibration and review, and then maybe even as much as 2 weeks later or maybe even a month later is when you actually have the increment conversation. Mm-hmm. So just breaking these two down and not doing them together makes a huge difference. The second, of course, is one of my other favorite topics, and again we could spend an hour on it, but is ratings. And ratings themselves, when you're communicating ratings to team members, that itself to a great extent takes away from the impact of the performance conversation, because rather than telling the person about what they need to develop, having them open to understanding that, it suddenly becomes, but why did you rate me like this? Now, there are two ways of addressing that. First of all, if you have 5 different goals or you have 3 goals, let's talk about how you have performed on each of those goals. Do I need to summarize that and say, because of how you performed on each of these 3 goals, therefore your rating is this? Doesn't matter. Why do I need to get into the rating? I need to tell the person, goal 1, this is how you did, this is what you were doing well, this is where you need to do better. Goal 2, goal 3. At a more comprehensive level, overall, these are some of the key areas that you need to work on. These are some of the key areas that you should leverage more. The moment you get into a rating, then you're suddenly trying to put everything together. Yes, ratings are used by organizations and they're necessary, especially when you need to do compensation management at scale, when you need to do promotion reviews at scale, when you need to do even performance calibration at scale. It's important because otherwise you can't have that. You can't be suddenly discussing 100 employees with 5 goals each and how they have done. But that's an internal administrative process. That shouldn't be your primary aim to tell the employee or the team member. The employee or the team member needs to know what they need to develop, what they need to do more of. They don't need to be given a label, or and in giving that label, suddenly you've got the person thinking more about the label rather than what they really need to do.
Right.
And that's where I
Right.
was, something that I said right in the beginning as well, that we as HR professionals have gotten so used to needing to run things at scale that we forget the true flavor. Yes, to be able to administer at scale, to be able to make pay increment decisions at scale, you do need a rating. But is it necessary to communicate that rating to the team member? And I've had this discussion, with some of my clients where they say, "Arey, rating nahi bolenge, to then how do we justify the increment to the person?"
Yeah.
I'm saying you justify the increment to the person by explaining to them where you see them in terms of their proficiency for the role, because that is what you're setting the new salary on the basis of. You don't necessarily need to give them a rating. Even when you're doing a bonus calculation, yes, for a bonus calculation, you assign weights to different goals and then you come out with a final number. But don't assign that label to it. That number just translates to what percentage of your target payout you get as actuals.
Right. No, I think this is really insightful, Saurabh, and I think a great takeaway for a lot of people listening to this and who will listen to this in the future, because that has been a pet concern I've seen come across from a lot of people around me. So I think thanks for that. Now, very quickly, sort of moving on to the process side of reviews. I had a few questions there as people start looking at setting up their review cycles and making those decisions. The first one which comes to mind is like, what is the right frequency? Like most organizations today, we still see are on an annual review cycle. People are trying to go more frequent and doing it maybe twice a year, maybe quarterly. But as you increase the frequency, also comes the challenge of increasing the administrative burden, not only on the HR teams, but also on the managers per se, who have to do those reviews. So what is it that is recommended? Like, is there a balance which can be struck here?
So again, there's no one size fits all. What's more important is that once you've set a particular frequency, then that happens. Because when it doesn't happen as per the defined frequency, then, if I were a team member, my takeaway would be that the organization doesn't care enough or my manager doesn't care enough. So that's where HR also needs to play a little bit of a balancing act. Yes, we as professionals believe that feedback has to be frequent. We believe that even synthesizing that feedback or doing performance check-ins, etc., are important. The more you do of it, the better. But then if that's all they're doing, then when's the work going to happen? And we've seen, as recently as a couple of weeks ago, where Google announced recently that they're doing away with their old performance management system and they're moving to a new approach which is more simplified, which does not take up so much time. In my mind, if you can make the performance check-ins or the performance discussions quick, regular, not overly taxing in terms of the huge amounts of documentation, etc., then quarterly actually is still a great frequency. Because 3 months is a good amount of time to observe a person's performance and to be able to synthesize feedback and give them the larger picture. But at minimum, I would say it needs to be done 6 monthly. And the reason I'm saying that is that you can't set expectations for a team member at the beginning of the year and then at the end of the year tell them, oh, this is where you're at. As managers, as HR professionals, our job is to help bring the best out of the team member. We're not here to ding people, and we're not here to say that, oh, you know what, let this person keep underperforming. At the end of the year, I'm going to kick them out. No, we've invested huge amounts of time, money to hire that person, to develop that person. It's in our best interest to make sure that that person does well. So the more frequently we're telling them, the more frequently we're giving them the chance to do a course correction, the better it is. And therefore, I would say at minimum, it needs to be 6 monthly. I would ideally, and in fact, with a lot of my clients, I recommend a quarterly one, but keep it simple, keep it short.
Awesome. So, like, following on from this, sort of like, in the interest of making it frequent and simplifying the reviews at the same time, what are the quick settings if I can say so, you can recommend, like in terms of how can we make it simple? Can we make it simple by choosing lesser stakeholders? Like what kind of stakeholders to choose? What kind of parameters to review people on? Are these the two aspects which people can work with when trying to simplifying, or are there any recommended settings per se over there which people can look at when trying to simplify and increase frequency at the same time?
So yeah, I'd tend to agree with you. I think it's important to look at who are the stakeholders who are giving feedback. I personally am a fan of 360 feedback, and the reason I say that is that increasingly in today's organizations, in the kinds of roles people play today, there are multi-stakeholder interactions. And as a manager, you're not actually sitting on top of that person and monitoring everything that they do. You're in fact, there's that increasing philosophy of the manager as a coach. Now if that is happening, then there are a lot of things that the manager does not see, and therefore it's important to get multi-stakeholder feedback. And again, getting that feedback from clients, or whether it be internal clients or external clients, from people who are more senior to that individual, from people who are more junior to that individual, all of that is important. So I would say it's important to select stakeholders across the entire spectrum. But again, do you need 30 people to be submitting feedback? It's really about how do you select the respondees appropriately. So you don't want to have too many respondees, because you also don't want the entire organization to be spending the next 1 month just filling feedback for each other. The second part of it, which was when you spoke about the parameters, and I think that's very interesting. So traditional 360 forms that I have seen tend to ask the respondee to rate the person on multiple different parameters, competency based, etc., etc. How easy or difficult is it for a person to objectively give that feedback? And let's take this away from the world of HR, and let's say that Yashat, you were just telling me about a new restaurant that you went to in Bangalore yesterday. What will I ask you? Will I ask you that, Yashat, what was the waiting time at the restaurant? What was the kind of cutlery that was provided to you? Were the ingredients fresh or not? What was the taste of the food? What was the presentation? You'll go crazy answering those questions. I will ask you a simple question. Yashat, would you recommend that I go to this restaurant? You'll say yes. And then I'll say, okay, Yashat, what really stood out for you about this restaurant? What were the things that you think were not that great about that restaurant? So if I can simplify it to that level, to things that are observable, to things that people can easily comment on, that's where 360 feedback becomes a lot more powerful. And in fact, I think Deloitte does this. Deloitte has this 4 questions only 360 feedback format.
Yeah. No, I think that's the recipe taking the restaurant example forward. So that's the recipe for simplifying the reviews is what you're saying. That we kind of just make it super simple, ask questions, and we can probably do away with a lot of the things which we get feedback today on. Just make it super simple. Just ask the 3-4 questions which you mentioned. Companies like Deloitte do. We've also seen companies like Adobe and I think Cisco follow the same. And in fact, we at Super Beings also offer that capability in the form of performance snapshots, where organizations can set up a quick 3 to 4 question feedback loop at a frequency which they want to, just to simplify and gather those data points at a frequent basis. So this is great, Saurabh. I think this mostly covers most of what I wanted to cover in today's talk, and we are almost on time. Is there anything you would recommend which we might have missed today in today's conversations, specifically when it comes to organizations looking to start setting up their performance management systems and starting to think about how to go about managing performance in their organizations? Or even for that matter, even if the performance system is established, how can organizations start looking at adopting and identifying the best practices? So if you have any last pieces of advice there, would love to get that sort of from you.
So I think we've covered pretty much most of these aspects. What I would do is probably say that if there are 3 takeaways that I would want to leave people with, the first and most important takeaway is please understand what is the spirit of performance management. The spirit of performance management is to help people develop, to help them get better at what they're doing, to help them deliver better, to help them grow. It is not to say that I have a limited compensation budget and how am I going to distribute that compensation budget. That is not the objective of performance management. And keep in mind that as an organization, as an HR team, as managers, we have invested time in hiring people. We've invested money in hiring people. Cost of hiring is going up. So once we've got a person on board, it's in our best interest to develop that person and help them succeed. And that should be the spirit with which you approach performance management. The second takeaway is that try to keep things as simple as possible. People should be doing this because they want to do it, because they see value in it, not because it has been forced down upon them. Yes, as HR professionals, we have to monitor, we have to make sure that things are happening, that things are not falling through the cracks. But again, maintain the core spirit of simplicity and of providing value to the team member who's getting feedback or whose performance is being managed. The third key takeaway I would say is that, and to some extent it got covered in the second point, but understand that compensation increments are not the reason why you are doing performance management, and try to de-link the two.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Saurabh. So I think this is all I had today. It was a really, really insightful session. A lot of learnings for everyone here. Now, I'm sure after hearing to this and the thoughts you've put forward, a lot of people might want to be in touch just to see if you can help them out setting up their PMS systems. So would it be okay for people to reach out to you? And if so, what is the best way people can reach out to you?
Absolutely, Yashat. Would love to speak to more people, and if there are organizations that I can help, I would love to do that. People can, just reach out to me on add me to LinkedIn, and then you can message me directly.
Sure. So for the benefit of the audience, I'll probably be sharing your credentials and the LinkedIn social profiles along with this talk so that they can reach out to you, can essentially see if there's an opportunity to work together and there's an opportunity you can help them out. But thanks again, Saurabh, for the talk today. It was really helpful, really insightful, and we covered a lot of aspects on the performance piece today. We will probably follow it up with a more hands-on practical conversation from one of the organizations I'm working with on how they went about setting up their performance systems and what were the key decisions they had to take. But this sets a great kind of base for all the audience to kind of build upon. And I'm really thankful for that. And really look forward to hosting you on some of our future sessions where we can probably go into your favorite topics on compensation and stuff, because those I think are challenges which a lot of founders go through as they think about performance in their organizations. So thanks again, Saurabh, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Ishat. Really happy to be in here and glad to have had this discussion, and definitely look forward to more conversations with you.